The trauma doors hadn't finished swinging open before the dog stopped everyone in the room cold. It was a Belgian Malinois, brindle and black, low to the ground with its weight forward, and it had positioned itself between the gurney and every person in that room before the paramedics had finished announcing what they'd brought in. The man on the gurney was a federal marshal. That was what the transport manifest said, and he was losing blood from a wound in his upper right abdomen and another along his left flank, and his pressure was already in a range that made the attending physician's jaw tighten when he read the monitor. Nobody in that room could reach him. The dog had seen to that. It wasn't barking. It wasn't lunging. It was simply present in the specific, immovable way of an animal that has been trained to do exactly one thing until it receives a command to stop. Its eyes tracked every movement simultaneously. A nurse stepped left. The dog's gaze moved. A resident shifted his weight. The dog noticed. One of the paramedics reached toward the gurney rail, and the dog made a sound, low, sustained, not quite a growl, and the paramedic withdrew his hand without being asked twice. Eastbrook General's head of security had both hands out like he was approaching a car crash, slow and careful and useless. Dr. Ronald Meade, the attending on call, was standing at the far wall with the specific expression of a man who has just encountered a situation not covered in his residency. The duty nurse, Pruitt, had pressed herself flat against the medication cabinet. And then a woman in navy scrubs walked through the trauma bay doors, looked at the scene for exactly 3 seconds, and started walking toward the dog. Meade said, "Don't." She didn't stop. Her name was Ingrid Solano. She'd been working the overnight shift at Eastbrook General for 11 months. She knew where the supply carts were kept, which attending physicians made good calls under pressure and which ones froze, and which sections of the ER got the worst light at 3 a.m. She had a talent for knowing these things quickly. She had a talent, people had noticed, for a lot of things that weren't explained by her credentials. She walked to within 8 feet of the dog and stopped. She kept her hands visible. She kept her posture open. She did not look away from the dog's eyes. She said 5 words in a register that was not loud and not soft and did not belong in an emergency room in Clarion County, Virginia at 2:14 in the morning. The dog sat immediately, completely, without any residual tension in its body. The trauma bay was silent for a long moment. "Get to him," Ingrid said. "He's got maybe 6 minutes of usable pressure left." Dr. Meade blinked, and then the room came alive. Ingrid had come to Eastbrook 11 months ago because it was quiet, and because it was 2 states away from the last place she'd worked, and because the job posting had listed night shifts as a preference rather than a requirement, which had struck her as a sign that the administration was flexible enough to tolerate someone who didn't fit neatly into patterns. She was 31. She had close-cropped dark hair and the kind of stillness that made people underestimate her until something happened that required a different assessment. She'd told the nursing director during her interview that she'd spent several years in federal law enforcement before transitioning to healthcare. She'd told her that her clinical training had come in unorthodox settings and that some of it was difficult to document in full. She'd handed over her nursing license, which was valid, her certifications, which were current, and a reference from a federal trauma physician in another state whose name she'd been cleared to use. The director, a measured woman named Sylvia Holt, had asked 3 questions and then offered her the position. She'd asked whether Ingrid's federal background would create security complications for the hospital. Ingrid had said no. She'd asked whether there were any active legal matters connected to her previous employment. Ingrid had said no. She'd asked whether Ingrid was leaving federal service voluntarily. Ingrid had said yes, which was technically accurate. The investigation that had preceded her departure was closed. The findings had been sealed. The outcome had been a mutual agreement to part ways with no formal finding against either party, which was the institutional language for a situation in which the right thing had been done, for reasons the institution wasn't comfortable putting in writing. She didn't talk about it. She'd spent 11 months at Eastbrook being exactly good enough to keep her position and exactly careful enough not to be remarkable. She was good at it, not brilliant at it, which would have been easy, but measured, which required more effort. She stopped being measured on the night the marshal came in. She should have let Meade take the lead on the dog situation. She knew that, standing in the doorway watching the room locked down. She knew the correct move was to radio behavioral specialists and wait for a handler and accept that someone might die while the right protocol was followed. She'd known the correct move. She'd crossed the room anyway. The reason was simple, and it was the same reason it always was. The man on the gurney needed help, and she was the only one in the room who could provide it. The dog's name, she'd learn later, was Cobalt. He was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, assigned to a U.S. Marshal Service protective detail program. He'd been trained to a behavioral protocol that Ingrid had last encountered during a joint operation between Army Criminal Investigation Division and the Marshals Service 5 years ago. A surveillance assignment she was technically still not cleared to discuss in detail. She'd been trained in the release protocols for working dogs on that assignment. She'd used them twice in the field. She used them a third time in the trauma bay at Eastbrook General, and then she turned around and told the room to get to work. Joseph Quill was 53 years old, a senior deputy marshal assigned to the Eastern District's Witness Security Division. He'd been found by a passing motorist on a rural highway 17 miles outside Clarion County, his service vehicle overturned in a drainage ditch. 2 penetrating wounds, a concussion, and preliminary blood work that came back, while Ingrid was managing his lines, showing something she didn't like in his clotting factors. "He's developing a coagulopathy," she said to Meade. "His fibrinogen's off. We need to address this before imaging." Meade looked at the result. It's borderline. It's trending. If he was anticoagulated prior to the injury, or there's something else running concurrent that we haven't found yet, we're going to be fighting the bleed when he's on the table. Meade was a good doctor. He was not always a fast decision maker. He looked at the result again, looked at Ingrid and said, "What do you recommend?" She walked him through it, not with authority, but with the careful, measured language of a nurse making an observation the attending could take or leave. Meade took it. He ordered the additional labs, adjusted the protocol. When the CT confirmed a grade 3 hepatic laceration and a smaller bleed at the right iliac fossa that hadn't been visible on initial assessment, the surgical consult arrived to a patient in better condition than he should have been. The surgeon, a compact woman named Dr. Patricia Sheen, who'd been pulled from home and arrived with the composure of someone who treated middle-of-the-night emergencies as routine, because they were, looked at the CT images and then looked at Ingrid. "You flagged the second bleed before imaging?" I mentioned it as a possibility. On what basis? The pressure drop pattern wasn't consistent with the hepatic injury alone, and his muscle tone was off in the right lower quadrant, not matching the pain distribution. Sheen studied the image for another moment. "You felt that?" "Yes." Sheen didn't ask anything else. She went to scrub in. The meeting with hospital administration happened 9 days later. It was called by Nelson Cray, Director of Clinical Operations, who had an office on the 3rd floor with credentials on the wall and a desk positioned to communicate authority and a tone in his voice that Ingrid recognized as the institutional register of a person who had already decided what conclusion a meeting was supposed to reach. She sat down without remarking on the chairs. "We've been reviewing the events of last Tuesday," Cray said. He had a folder on his desk. He set his hand on it but didn't open it. "Your response to the marshal's arrival, specifically the way you handled the animal. I used a release protocol I was trained in. That training isn't documented in your personnel file." "No, it was part of a joint federal operation that's partially classified." "The concern," Cray said, "is the pattern. Over 11 months, you've intervened on cases outside your assigned coverage area. You've redirected attending physicians. You've made clinical observations that have outperformed the formal assessments of physicians with significantly more experience." He paused. "The question is whether your civilian nursing credentials accurately represent your actual background." Ingrid looked at him steadily. "My license is current. My certifications are valid." "That's not in question." "Then I'm not sure what is." Your history prior to nursing school contains a 5-year gap. Cray opened the folder. We've been unable to account for it. She'd known this was coming. She'd known since the night Cobalt sat down in the trauma bay and every person in that room looked at her like she'd done something impossible. I worked in federal law enforcement, she said. Criminal investigations. I can provide what I'm authorized to disclose, but there are elements of my service record that I'm not in a position to share in a civilian employment file. What elements? The kind that are sealed. Cray studied her. Hospital policy requires full background disclosure for staff in clinical roles. I've disclosed everything I'm legally permitted to disclose. Another pause. We'll need more, Nurse Solano. Either you provide a complete history within 5 business days, or we'll need to discuss your continued placement here. She nodded once. She stood and left the office. In the stairwell, she breathed through her nose, the way she'd been trained to breathe when the situation required stillness, and thought about 5 years with the Army Criminal Investigation Division. 3 overseas deployments, 2 federal task forces, 1 internal investigation that had ended with her resignation because she'd reported what she'd seen, and what she'd seen was not something her chain of command wanted on record. She'd given them a choice, put it in writing, or she'd walk. They'd chosen neither. They'd sealed the file and offered her a separation agreement, and she'd taken it and driven south until the landscape changed. The past didn't want to stay where she'd put it. She'd always known that. She'd just been hoping for a longer head start. She submitted the history on a Monday morning, sealed in an envelope, left with Cray's administrative assistant before her shift started. By Thursday, she could tell it had been read. The change was in the small things. The way Meade stopped bringing his borderline cases to her station for a second opinion. The way 2 of the overnight nurses moved differently around her, with the particular careful energy of people recalibrating someone they thought they'd understood. The way Holt looked at her once from across the break room and looked away. The building was adjusting to the fact of her, not celebrating, not condemning, adjusting. On Friday afternoon, Cray sent a message to her unit inbox. Please come to my office first thing Monday morning. She read it twice. She knew what it meant. She went home and ran 6 miles in the dark along the county road outside her apartment and thought about what it meant to spend years becoming something and then spend more years trying to put it somewhere it would stay. She was 3 miles out when her phone rang. Unknown number, she answered it. Nurse Solano? The voice was male, mid-40s, flat command register, someone accustomed to delivering information rather than having conversations. My name is Senior Inspector David Harkin. I'm calling on behalf of Deputy Marshal Quill. He's been transferred back to Eastbrook General this afternoon. His recovery took a complication overnight at the Federal Medical Facility. He specifically requested to return to your hospital. A pause. He also asked for you by name. There's something else. The incident that put him in your ER 11 days ago has been reclassified. It wasn't a road accident. We have evidence it was an intercept deliberate. The investigation is active. Another pause. Cobalt is with him. Ingrid looked at the dark road ahead of her. How is Quill? She said. Alive. He wants to see you. She turned around and ran back toward her car. The ICU was quiet at 10 p.m. in the way hospital ICUs were quiet. Machines running, monitors recording, the controlled stillness of a floor where everything that needed doing was already being done or was being watched for. Cobalt was outside the room. Not inside, outside, which meant someone had reached an accommodation with the dog about the glass panel. He was seated against the wall beside the door with the absolute, focused attention of an animal doing a job. When Ingrid came down the corridor, his gaze found her at 40 feet and tracked her all the way in. She crouched down when she reached him. He's okay, she said quietly. You got him here. He's okay. Cobalt pressed his nose briefly against her palm. Then he returned to his formal posture. Inside the room, Quill was awake. Pale and moving carefully, the way people moved when the anesthesia had fully cleared, but the tissue memory of surgery hadn't. He had the eyes of a man who'd been lying in a hospital bed for about 11 days, thinking hard about something he didn't have all the pieces for yet. He looked at Ingrid when she came in. "You're the one who talked to Cobalt," he said. "Yes. He only responds to side join-op protocols." "I know. Those aren't public knowledge." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. He had the kind of face that had absorbed considerable experience without letting it make him hard. Still capable of curiosity, still capable of something that looked like trust, which in her experience was harder to hold on to than toughness. "Who are you, really?" he said. "A nurse, that's what I am right now." He accepted that the way people sometimes accepted things they weren't fully satisfied with when they understood the reason for the limitation. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "It's relevant to what happened to me, and it may be relevant to you personally." He shifted carefully, managing the discomfort. "The case I was working before the intercept, witness security for a federal corruption proceeding. One of the defendants had access to my protection details assignment records, knew where I was going, when, and who I'd be working with." A pause. "Part of what they pulled from those records was a list of every medical facility along my travel routes, in case something went wrong, in case they made something go wrong." Ingrid was very still. Someone cross-referenced that list against staff records, looking for anyone with a law enforcement or military intelligence background who might complicate a recovery situation, who might notice things that a standard ER team wouldn't. He looked at her directly. "They flagged this hospital. They flagged you, 6 weeks before the intercept." She let that settle. "They knew I was here. They knew someone with a CID background was at Eastbrook. They didn't know your name until the night I was brought in." He paused. "The complaint filed against you with the State Nursing Board, requesting an emergency review of your credentials, that was filed at 8 p.m. on the night I arrived, 4 hours after I came through your doors." She thought about Cray's folder, the Monday meeting. "Cray didn't file it," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd already started working through the shape of it. The hospital's outside legal counsel filed it, a man named Edmund Burke. He'd been retained through a firm with documented ties to 2 of the individuals under federal indictment. Quill watched her absorb this. "He was given your name and a summary of your military background the same night I arrived. He filed the complaint before the ER shift was over." Ingrid stood in the particular quiet of someone for whom a number of things that hadn't made sense have just arranged themselves into a pattern that does. "He was trying to get me pulled before anyone understood what I'd seen," she said. "Before you could be a witness, before you could testify about Cobalt's response to you, which established your background, which made you credible in ways that complicated their case." He paused. "They didn't anticipate you. You weren't supposed to be the variable that functioned." She thought about 11 months of careful calibration, about staying just visible enough and just invisible enough, and how exhausting it was to maintain the distance between those two things. "What happens now?" she said. "Federal agents have been on site since this morning. Burke is being interviewed. The indictment is moving forward on an accelerated timeline." He looked at her steadily. "And your nursing license is not in jeopardy. Harkin's office has already contacted the state board. The complaint was initiated with fraudulent purpose, using improperly obtained information. They're closing it." She stood in the quiet of the room. The monitor recorded his vitals. Cobalt sat outside the glass. "You should rest," she said. "Probably." He looked at the ceiling. "One more thing." She waited. "Your CD file," he said, "the internal investigation, the sealed findings." He paused in a way that told her he'd spent time on this before she'd walked into the room. "I pulled them 2 days ago. What you reported. What you saw and documented and refused to walk back even when your career was the cost." He stopped. "That report has been sitting sealed for 5 years because the people who were supposed to act on it chose not to. It's being reopened as part of the evidentiary record in the federal case. It's going to matter in ways it should have mattered 5 years ago." Ingrid looked at the window. The ICU corridor was lit and empty. Outside, Clarion County's particular dark pressed against the glass. She had carried that report for 5 years. She had written it meticulously and honestly and handed it up the chain in good faith. and she had watched what happened to good faith in an institution that valued its own continuity above the things she'd understood, perhaps naively, to be the point. She'd walked away with nothing except the knowledge that somewhere in a sealed file, the truth had been written down. That was the most she'd been able to do with it. She hadn't expected anyone to ever find it. "Okay," she said. She updated his handoff note. She paused at the door. "Burke's complaint runs through the hospital's administrative structure," she said, "which means Cray is going to find out tonight that the legal action he was facilitating was connected to a federal corruption case." Quill looked at her. "Yes." "Is there anyone senior at the hospital who needs to know that before Monday?" "Harkin is meeting with your hospital's board liaison at 7 a.m. tomorrow." He held her gaze. "It's being handled." She nodded once and left the room. The board meeting happened on a Saturday morning, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously it was being taken. She was not in the room for the first hour of it. She was on the floor doing the things that needed doing. At 9:15, a woman named Constance Drell, the board's patient services chair, found her at the station and said quietly that the board would appreciate a few minutes of her time. The third-floor conference room had 6 people in it. 3 board members, Holt, Sheen, and a man from Harkin's office named Holst, who sat in the corner and said nothing and wrote things in a small notebook. Drell sat at the center of the table. She was in her early 60s, precise in her clothing and in the way she arranged her words, and she looked at Ingrid with the direct attention of someone who had spent the morning revising her understanding of a situation and arrived at a conclusion she was prepared to state plainly. "Nelson Cray has been placed on administrative leave pending review of his conduct in this matter," Drell said. "The complaint filed by outside counsel against your license has been formally withdrawn by this institution. We've communicated to the state board that the filing was made without authorization and using information obtained improperly. They've accepted our communication and closed the proceedings against you." Ingrid said nothing. "I also want to address something directly." Drell glanced at the other board members and continued. "The events of the past 2 weeks have made visible something we should have understood when we hired you. Not the details of your federal background, but the plain fact of what you bring to this hospital and to the patients in it. What you did on the night Marshal Quill arrived was not reckless. It was the only available action in a situation where the protocol had no provision, and the outcome speaks for itself." Sheen said, "I've been practicing surgery for 22 years. What Ingrid did in my OR, the preparation, the anticipation, the instrument management, I don't encounter that in standard trauma nurses. I encounter it in people who've worked under conditions considerably more demanding than anything in this hospital." She said it looking at Ingrid directly, not performing anything, just saying what was true. Holt spoke last, carefully, in the way of someone who had decided to say a hard thing and was going to say it cleanly. "I brought you in because you had current credentials and strong references. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked about what was underneath those credentials. That's our failure, not yours." She paused. "What that means is that we've had a nurse with your specific training working our overnight ER for 11 months, and the institutional response was to open a review about whether you belonged here. It should have been the opposite." The room was quiet. "We'd like to offer you a formal expanded role," Drell said. "Working alongside our trauma team on high-acuity cases, specifically patients with complex histories that the standard framework doesn't adequately address. We want to build that capability properly, with the right documentation and the right support." She looked at Ingrid. "We want to stop treating what you bring as a liability and start treating it as what it actually is." Ingrid looked at Sheen, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who'd made their argument and was waiting for the person across the table to reach the same conclusion. She thought about 5 years of service and 5 years of trying to leave it. She thought about 11 months of measured restraint and the daily effort of staying just small enough to fit. She thought about Cobalt sitting outside the glass at 10 p.m., doing the job he'd been trained to do, holding his post, not because he was unafraid, but because the job mattered more than what fear told him to do. Yes, she said. Quill was discharged 18 days later. She was in the hall outside his room when the transport team arrived because he'd asked her to be. He moved carefully, the way people moved when the body had been through something significant and was still accounting for it. But his eyes were clear, and his expression carried the settled quality of someone who had taken stock of his situation and decided it was survivable. Cobalt loaded into the transport vehicle first, no hesitation, just work. Quill stopped at the door and looked back. The federal case is moving forward, he said. You'll be called for a statement. Harkin's office will be in touch. He paused. The sealed report is part of the evidentiary record now. What you wrote 5 years ago is going to matter. She looked at him. They should have listened to you then, he said. He wasn't saying it to make her feel better. He was saying it because it was a fact, and he was a man who stated facts plainly. They didn't, and you still did the right thing, and then you walked away with your integrity intact while they kept the file. He paused. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole of it. He got into the vehicle. The doors closed. She watched it pull out of the hospital bay into the Clarion County morning, which was cold and gray and indifferent in the specific way of rural Virginia in late autumn. Cobalt was visible for a moment through the rear window, alert and upright, his attention already forward. Then the vehicle turned, and they were gone. The expanded role was approved 6 weeks later. There were budget negotiations and credentialing conversations and a process of assembling documentation from her Army record that she'd spent 5 years not looking at. There were days she went home tired in a different way than ER shift tired from building something rather than maintaining something, and sat at her kitchen table with cold coffee and wondered if she'd overestimated her own capacity for this kind of visibility. She kept going anyway. Bram Holloway, Eastbrook's overnight security chief, a large, quiet man in his late 40s who moved through the building with the deliberate economy of someone who'd been somewhere that required it, stopped her one morning in the parking garage. He looked at her for a moment. You good? He said. Getting there, she said. He nodded once, the way people nodded when the answer was true enough, and went back inside. 3 months after Quill's discharge, a letter arrived through official channels. Inside was a single document, an excerpt from the reopened CID internal investigation file, bearing a formal finding that the original report had been accurate and complete, that the reporting agent had acted with integrity under institutional pressure, and that the prior decision to seal rather than act on the findings was under administrative review. At the bottom of the page, in the notes field, someone had added a line that wasn't formal language. She told the truth when it cost her everything. The record should have always said so. She didn't know who had written it. It might have been Quill. It might have been someone in the records authority who'd worked on the restoration and had wanted to say something the official language couldn't hold. It didn't matter. It was true, and that was what mattered. She put the document in the drawer of her desk, not hidden. Just set aside in the way you set aside things that are part of you, but don't need to be displayed to be real. Then she made coffee, finished it while it was still warm, and drove to Eastbrook General through the cold county morning with the heater running and the radio off. She badged through the entrance, checked the overnight notes, confirmed the status of 2 patients she'd been watching, and walked to the window at the end of the hall that faced east. The county spread out flat and pale in the early light, bare fields, a line of trees, the wide emptiness of rural Virginia in winter. She stood there for 30 seconds, not thinking about anything specific, just present. Then she turned around and went to work. There are people every institution acquires without fully understanding what it's acquiring, people whose capabilities were built in places the institution's onboarding forms don't have a box for. The institution responds the way institutions always respond. It tries to contain what it can't categorize, manage the edges into something legible, find the policy that makes the irregularity documentable. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the person who doesn't fit is precisely what was missing. And what looks like a liability turns out to be the only reason someone came home alive. The difference isn't visible until the moment when it is, When the monitor alarms and the room goes silent and someone steps forward who knows exactly what to do. Not because they read it in a protocol, but because they have been in the place where that knowledge is written in the only ink that doesn't wash out. Ingrid Solano had been in that place. She walked into the first room on her morning rounds and said, without ceremony, "Good morning, tell me what's going on." The patient looked at her, the specific look of someone who has been poked and measured and talked at all morning, and something in their expression settled. Because she was asking. Because she was genuinely asking, and she would stay in the room for the answer. She listened. That was where it always started. Not with the cleared file or the reinstated credentials or the federal case moving forward on its appropriate timeline. It started here, in a hospital room, with a person who was frightened and in pain and another person who understood what that felt like and was not going to look away from it. That had always been the job. She was finally doing it as her whole self, and her whole self, it turned out, was more than enough.